Okay, one of your observations during this time prompted you to ask the following question. What is it about coming from a lower social class group that makes schooling so hard? This is from one of your books of selected works. What was or is your answer to that question?
Well, that is the 64,000 multiplied many times over question in education. And people are still trying to figure out what is it that makes schooling harder for lower economic. It's a class and it's a race issue, and sorting out those two things out and what best to do. Literally, many people in the academy will give many different answers to that question. I was asking it way back when I went back to graduate school in 1961, after teaching in this public school in Stratford, Connecticut, because the kids in that school were all working class, white, African American, and the beginning of a Puerto Rican migration northward into cities, in this case surrounding the Bridgeport. And the fathers of all of these, white, black, Puerto Rican, had good, what Trump thinks he can bring back, good paying blue collar jobs. They worked in the Singer sewing machine in the Stratford area, Sikorsky helicopter, factory work like that. Good paying. This was not real poverty. And the neighborhood didn't look anything like we now think of as inner city.
Sure.
Low-rise housing developments, places for kids to play. And we thought we had a pretty good elementary school. One indicator that I use is that at 4:45 in the afternoon, long couple of hours after the kids, 2 or 3 hours after the kids have left, the teachers' parking lot was still full as teachers were busy getting all prepared for the next day. And yet there were men teachers in that elementary school, as well as women. One of them became a very good colleague of mine. And yet, if we tried to find out how our kids did when they went on to high school, they ended up in the lowest track. It was a streamed, tracked school. So I was trying to figure out why this was so. We thought we gave them a good start, but it didn't hold up. And at the same time, just at that time, in the late 50s, when I was doing this teaching, just before going back to, deciding to go back to Harvard for graduate work, Jerome Bruner, whom I understand you have also interviewed, and I'm so glad you did before his recent death at, I think, 102. He had published a book which was very influential at the time, called The Process of Education. And I have a visual memory of sitting in the Bridgeport Public Library, because we lived in Bridgeport, which is just a very short commute to the school at Stratford where I taught. I can remember sitting in the Bridgeport Public Library reading The Process of Education and dreaming of going back to Harvard and having Jerome Bruner as a professor, which I did. And later became a colleague, and he certainly was one of the people who was influential in my development, career development.
When you went back to Harvard, what did you end up studying for your dissertation?
Well, I started with this question you asked about the role of language in why working class kids don't do so well. So I decided if I was going to try and answer that question, I better take a course in language and language development. And there was of Harvard courses, there are some that were just undergraduates, for just undergraduates, and some that were just for graduate students. And then there was this middle category for graduates and undergraduates. And the courses in that category were known to be very difficult for undergraduates. They were just a higher level. And there was one called the Psychology of Language. And I took that my first semester. You take 4 courses at Harvard, and I must have spent 3/4 of my study time boning up on the psychology that I didn't know.
Sure.
To have the background to take in that course. Well, I got hooked by that course. Jerome Bruner, it was not his overall course, but he certainly gave a lecture. Noam Chomsky came up the river from MIT and gave a lecture. It was an amazing and wonderful course, and I got hooked and stayed with things to do with language and cognition. And Jerry Bruner's work was more in cognitive psychology, but he collaborated with people in linguistics. So I actually, I was in the ed school as far as getting a degree, but I took a lot of courses in psychology and what was then called social relations, which was a mix of sociology and anthropology and so on.
Tell us at the time about your experiences with the war on poverty.
Well, when I started at Harvard in '61. I got my degree in '65. '65 was after Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson was president. I later found out when the one time I went to the capital of Texas, Austin. Went to Austin and visited the Johnson Library, which is there. Johnson being a Texan man. And found out that President Johnson started life as a school teacher.
Oh, interesting.
Which I didn't know. I thought that was interesting. And he really wanted to be to become known as the education president. But of course he was defeated by the Vietnam War. He became known as the Vietnam War president. But he had a great interest in education, and in his war on poverty, there was a big component of money for education. And I got involved in two pieces of that, supported by two pieces of that money. One was Head Start.
Okay.
And I believe you've also interviewed Ed Gordon.
Correct.
And Ed was at that time, I think he was the research director for Head Start.
I believe so.
Head Start was just starting. 65 may have been the first summer that it was full-time. 64 was more experimental, I think, in a few places. So I got involved in some of the research on Head Start, and it's one of its subsequent developments called the no, that was a development out of the television. But another part of the was Sesame Street, a TV program, which is still on. But Sesame Street began with foundation money, but along the way it benefited from being known as trying to answer the same question as the projects that were directly funded by President Johnson's war on poverty, namely helping working class and children of color do better in education. Just the groups that I was concerned about in my initial foray into going back to graduate school and then working in the field. So I got to know Ed Gordon then, and I'm glad to say that as far as I know, he's still alive.
He is.
Though he's I think I was in a wheelchair the last I
Is that right? I
saw
haven't
him.
seen him for a couple of years.